Chapter 13. China Syndrome. Mikhail Gorbachev and his colleagues had a full agenda for their Politburo meeting on May 5, 1986. But apart from reports on May Day parades that had taken place throughout the huge country, including in Kyiv, there was little to lift the spirits of the Soviet leadership. The view from the Kremlin was that of a country besieged at home and abroad. Abroad, the continuing war in Afghanistan weighed heavily on Soviet finances and damaged the image of the USSR in the international arena. It is clear that a military victory is impossible, no matter how many troops we have there, Gorbachev told his colleagues that morning. It is clear that we have not carried out the social revolution for the Afghans. The intention was doomed to failure from the very outset, and by definition. It is also clear that instead of building up our southern underbelly, we have gotten ourselves a zone of instability and internal conflict. We have provoked a much larger US presence in the region than before. We have incited the Muslim world against ourselves and pushed Pakistan into open hostility. In a word, this is a total defeat. At home, the Chernobyl explosion had punched another big hole in the Soviet budget and further damaged the international prestige of the country and its new leader. Even more disturbing, despite all the propaganda efforts to suggest that things were improving, no one could get a handle on the situation, which was becoming worse with every passing day. On May 5th, Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov got an update on the health impact of the catastrophe. The total number of those hospitalized has reached 2,757, of whom 569 are children, read a report. Of these, 914 show symptoms of radiation sickness, and 18 of them are in very serious condition. The previous day, the number of hospital admissions had been reported as 1,882, so the new data represented a daily increase of more than 45%. The patients showing symptoms of radiation sickness were no longer only firefighters, reactor operators, and local civilians. Also affected were members of the country's establishment, leaders and members of the State Commission who had been sent from Moscow to fix the problem. Now they were back, with the problem growing worse and their own health in jeopardy. On the previous evening, the plane carrying Boris Chernobyl, the head of the State Commission, and his numerous deputies and assistants, including government ministers and heads of departments, had landed at the Vnukovo airport in Moscow. Chernobyl and his colleagues boarded a waiting bus that took them directly to Hospital No. 6, where victims of the Chernobyl disaster were being treated for radiation sickness. They were examined by dosimetrists, undressed, washed, and shaved bald. Many of them remained in the hospital for further examination and treatment. The decision to bring Chernobyl and his team back to Moscow for health reasons had been made by Premier Ryzhkov during his visit to the area 2 days earlier. But before Chernobyl was allowed to take care of his health, he was asked to report to the Politburo on the results of his work. What he told the party bosses was anything but uplifting. The situation was grim. The emission of radioactive particles from the reactor, declining before May 2nd, had now shot back up and was climbing ever higher. The authorities no longer knew what to say, and May 3rd had passed without a press release. Bombing the reactor with sand and lead now seemed ineffective, and the helicopter runs had been reduced in number. On that day they were cancelled entirely. Many scientists were afraid of a new explosion. There was also another danger. It was termed the China Syndrome, after the title of a movie produced by Michael Douglas and featuring Jack Lemmon and Jane Fonda, along with Douglas. The film was released in the United States in March 1979 and shown to Soviet viewers in 1981. Its title came from an inside joke among nuclear scientists about nuclear reactor meltdown. The joke imagined that radioactive fuel from a damaged reactor could burn through the Earth's crust to its core, and then reappear on the other side of the globe in China. The greatest real concern, as explained in the film, was that the radioactive fuel would reach the water table. In Chernobyl, Some scientists were worried about the radioactivity released by the damaged reactor contaminating the Dnieper River basin and eventually the world's oceans. It would be a catastrophe affecting not just the region or even all of Europe, but of global proportions. Apart from Shcherbina, Gorbachev summoned the chief scientific advisor to the State Commission, Valery Legasov, to the Politburo meeting. Legasov flew to Moscow early on the morning of May the 5th. Before going to the Kremlin, he managed to get to his institute where he was cleansed of Chernobyl radiation. He also managed to spend a few minutes at home where he tried to calm his wife as best he could. She had been worried about him as no one, including Legasov, was allowed to place private calls from Chernobyl. The KGB imposed security measures, mostly intended to prevent the spread of information about the situation at the Chernobyl power plant and its environs, did not distinguish between highly placed academics and simple workers and engineers. Legasov arrived at the Kremlin at 10 a.m. and was brought to the Walnut Room where Politburo meetings had taken place since Stalin's time. The key question on everyone's mind was what to do next. Legasov later recalled that Gorbachev said right away that for now he was not interested in the problem of blame and reasons for the accident. He was interested in the state of affairs and in the necessary measures, and even additional ones, that the state would have to take in order to cope more quickly with the situation that had arisen. The discussion led to the adoption of a Politburo resolution stating that the number and pace of measures to eliminate the consequences of the accident at the Chernobyl atomic energy station are not yet commensurate with the scale and complexity of the problems posed by that extraordinary event. Gorbachev ordered everyone to go back to work, but there was little understanding of what had to be done to change the situation decisively. Gorbachev and his advisers were at a loss. The measures already taken were no longer working. Water pumped into the reactor during the first hours after the accident had flooded its lower levels, increasing the danger of a much more powerful explosion if the reactor disintegrated completely or burned down to its foundations. Many now believed that attempting to seal the reactor with sand and lead had contributed to a rise in temperature within the reactor, which also increased the possibility of an explosion. Shcherbina had been trying one method after another, hoping that something would work, but so far nothing had proved effective. He had exhausted not only all options at his disposal, but also the amount of time he could stay in the Chernobyl zone without jeopardizing his health even further. He was ordered to stay in Moscow and undergo medical treatment. The torch of chief troubleshooter at Chernobyl was passed from Shcherbina to Ivan Serhii, the grey-haired 55-year-old deputy head of the Soviet government and future leader of the Russian government, who, together with Boris Yeltsin, would organize the defense of the Russian parliament against coup leaders in August 1991. Calm, confident, and efficient, Serhii replaced Shcherbina as interim head of the government commission on May the 4th. But if top managers such as Boris Shcherbina were replaced, scientists were not. Serhii was badly in need of scientific advice and wanted Legasov back at his side. Legasov was asked to return to Chernobyl after spending only a few hours in the capital. Serhii wanted to reduce the probability of a new explosion by removing radioactive water from beneath Unit 4. It was a gruesome reminder of the first day of the catastrophe, when the operators had poured water on the reactor in the hope of preventing its destruction, which had already occurred. Once again, firefighters were assigned to the front line, this time with the task of using their equipment to drain water from the basement. Altogether, there were close to 20,000 tons of radioactive water underneath the reactor, which was rapidly heating up. The scientists endorsed this measure. We were afraid that some of the melted fuel would get in there and produce so much steam as to cause additional radioactivity outside, recalled Valery Legasov. The only way to accomplish the task was to penetrate the flooded underground corridors and open the valves. It was quite difficult to approach those bubbler pools because the corridors alongside had been filled with water from the moment they tried to cool the reactor with water, remembered Legasov. The water level and its radioactivity were high. At particular times and in particular places, the level of radioactivity in the water reached 1 curie per litre. It was a suicide mission, and Serhii fully understood that. It was then that he decided to save the situation by providing capitalist incentives. With the approval of the political leadership in Moscow, he offered financial bonuses to the divers who agreed to do the dangerous work, including free cars and apartments for them or their families. The operators of the power plant who knew its layout well went first. A crew of 3 engineers in diving suits reached the submerged gates of the pools and opened them to release the contaminated water into adjusting chambers, from which it could be pumped by the firefighters. Legasov later recalled the mixed feelings of a participant in the operation when he was presented with a monetary award during a public gathering. I saw the face of a man who was, on the one hand, proud of having accomplished that difficult task under difficult circumstances, remembered Legasov, but, on the other hand, one could see him crumpling that packet of money, not as an award. In sum, he found it inconvenient to refuse the money, but at the same time the monetary form of the award itself gave him little satisfaction, because in fact, and particularly at that time, people were struggling to deal with the accident, to bend all their efforts and do all they could, not thinking of any incentives, whether material or moral. All 3 engineers turned divers would die of radiation poisoning within weeks of their heroic action. Now that water was being removed from underneath the reactor, the possibility of a steam explosion in Unit 4 was significantly diminished. But the threat of the China syndrome, the radioactive poisoning of underground waters, was not eliminated. Radioactive water could flow into the Dnieper River basin, then into the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and finally the Atlantic and other oceans. It would be a realization of the biblical prediction of the star named Wormwood, falling into 1/3 of the world's rivers and making them bitter, that is, poisoned. The scientists wanted to keep radioactivity away from the water table, but disagreed on the means of doing so. Valery Legasov believed that the main threat was the radioactive water pumped from underneath the reactor, which could get back into the ground if not taken care of. He insisted on installing filters to purify it, which was done. On May the 4th, the military had begun elevating the banks of the Pripyat and other rivers and covering them with a chemical solution that would prevent radioactive particles washed by rain from penetrating the river system. It was the beginning of a long and laborious process. One of Legasov's colleagues, academician Yevgeny Velikhov, who arrived in Chernobyl in early May, had a different view, arguing that the main threat was that of the overheated reactor burning its way down to the water table. He proposed freezing the earth under the reactor in order to cool it down, and then building a concrete platform beneath the reactor's foundation to prevent the contamination of underground waters. Legasov was skeptical at best. Since Legasov and Velikhov were at odds, the new head of the government commission, Serhii, was at a loss, not knowing which project of the 2 academics to implement. In Ivankiv, a town 50 kilometers south of Chernobyl and the new headquarters of the State Commission, Legasov and Velikhov shared the same room, but little else. They were not just colleagues, but rivals. As first deputy director of the institute, Legasov, a chemist by training, was 1 rung above Velikhov, who was a physicist specializing in thermonuclear reactors, and one of many regular deputy directors of the institute. But Velikhov, who was only 1 year older than Legasov, had become a full member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences 7 years earlier than his competitor, and was already vice president of the Academy, a position that he had assumed in 1978. In 1979, an asteroid had been named after him, and in 1985 he was given the highest Soviet award, Hero of Socialist Labour. Although Legasov had been overlooked for that award, it now appeared that the authorities could not manage without him. Indeed, Legasov believed that Ivan Serhii wanted him back to counterbalance the influence of Velikhov. According to Velichov, he was sent to Chernobyl almost by accident on the fourth day after the disaster. He had attended one of the first meetings of the Politburo group headed by Nikolai Ryzhkov, which was meeting in Moscow almost daily to coordinate the activities of the Soviet ministries and agencies dealing with the Chernobyl catastrophe. Velichov had gone to one of the first meetings of Ryzhkov's group to share advice from one of his American friends, Frank von Hippel, a professor of physics at Princeton University and chair of the Federation of American Scientists, an organization created in 1945 by participants in the Manhattan Project to promote peace and security through science. After hearing of the Chernobyl accident, von Hippel had telegrammed Velichov suggesting that children be given potassium iodide tablets. Velichov brought von Hippel's telegram to the meeting. Ryzhkov told me that everyone who had been there, in Chernobyl, Shcherbina, Legasov, had received a dose, so they had to be relieved from duty, recalled Velichov. Off he went to Chernobyl to help manage the situation, while the others were getting ready to take a break. Once in the Chernobyl zone, Velichov played it safe, making no decisions on matters in which he did not consider himself an expert. As a physicist, however, he became increasingly concerned about the possibility of the active zone of the reactor burning through its foundations and reaching the water table under the power station. Legasov disagreed, saying Velichov was unduly concerned about it. Perhaps he had watched the American movie too many times. Legasov did not believe it was possible for the reactor to burn its way down into the lower levels of the unit. The possibility of such an event was extraordinarily slight, he recalled. Nevertheless, Yevgeny Pavlovich, Velichov, insisted that a concrete platform be built beneath the slab at the foundation of the reactor. Velichov never publicly questioned any of Legasov's proposals, but others did. Yuli Andreev, who worked on the deactivation of the nuclear plant, later remembered that Legasov was impetuously active in installing absorption filters to eliminate radionuclides from water, but it did not occur to him to check how much of the emission was soluble in water. It was wasted effort, the result of illiteracy in engineering. While Velichov may have known something about reactors, Legasov's knowledge of the subject was quite insignificant. Caught between the two quarreling scientists, Ivan Silayev decided to follow the advice of both. Legasov was allowed to install his water filters, while Velichov could go ahead with freezing the ground under the reactor and constructing a concrete platform there. The latter was an enormous undertaking. They began drilling around the reactor and pumping liquid nitrogen at a temperature of 100 degrees Celsius below zero into the tunnels. It was calculated that 25 tons of liquid nitrogen per day would be required to keep the earth around the reactor frozen and the reactor cool. It was anybody's guess whether that would work. The reactor kept heating up and erupting with clouds of radioactive dust, releasing close to 7 million curies into the atmosphere on May the 4th. Those clouds carried the radiation all over Europe. On the evening of May the 6th, Anatoly Romanenko, the Ukrainian Minister of Health, finally received approval to make a televised address to the population of Kyiv and the surrounding region about the dangers presented by the high levels of radiation. He assured the citizens of Kyiv that the radiation levels in the city were too low to cause any harm, but he also announced that wind direction and strength has changed recently, causing some increase of background radiation in the city and province. He then proceeded to advise on dealing with some increase of radiation. The Republican Ministry of Health considers it advisable to inform inhabitants of the city and province of Kyiv of recommendations to be observed in order to reduce substantially the degree of possible effect of radioactive substances on the organism. Romanenko continued, "As much as possible, the amount of time spent by children and pregnant women in open areas should be restricted. Above all, it should be taken into account that radioactive substances spread mainly in the form of aerosols. Hence it is advisable to close windows and ventilation panes in dwellings, and to prevent drafts. The traditional phobia of drafts, common to people in the Soviet republics, now took on a new significance in Ukraine. The Health Ministry's recommendations were finally given to the population more than 10 days after the explosion, and more than a week after contaminated clouds had reached the city. The population did not trust the authorities, and the official admission of what rumors had claimed long before that was interpreted as a worsening of the situation. The void created by the lack of reliable information was filled by rumors, and the news circulating among the citizens of Kyiv was disturbing indeed. Vitaly Masol, the head of the Ukrainian Planning Committee and a member of the State Commission, later recalled that what was at stake in early May was not just the future of the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, but also that of the city of Kyiv. At the very first meeting, which took place on May the 2nd at the Chernobyl atomic energy station itself, it was said that there might be another explosion affecting a zone with a radius of 500 kilometers, and in the dead zone, with a radius of 30 kilometers, nothing would be left alive, remembered Masol. To be perfectly honest, we were already preparing on the quiet for an evacuation of Kyiv. The Ukrainian authorities dreaded such a possibility. "I'm not even speaking of panic," recalled Masol. "What pillaging there would have been! All the stores would have been looted, private apartments, museums. Hundreds of people would have been crushed to death in train stations and airports." Kyiv, a city of more than 2.5 million citizens, was located 130 kilometers south of the epicenter, not in the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, but well within the 500-kilometer zone that would be devastated by another nuclear explosion. News of a possible new explosion and the potential evacuation of the city spread like wildfire. It came from scientists, engineers, managers, and bureaucrats who had access to the information available in Chernobyl. A secretary of the Ukrainian Central Committee, Boris Kachura, recalled that a group of experts sat in a room in the Central Committee building working out an evacuation plan. A great many people directly involved, scientists, doctors, and others, obviously knew about this, and it produced, well, a corresponding response on the part of the population. The KGB reported that a scientist in the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences had made his own prediction about a new explosion in the event of a complete meltdown of the reactor, followed by the spillage of radioactivity into underground waters. Kyiv was awaiting a new catastrophe, one of truly biblical proportions. People rushed to the airport and railroad ticket offices, but soon no tickets remained for planes, trains, or buses leaving the capital of Ukraine. People began storming ticket offices. On May the 6th, the Chernobyl Commission of the Ukrainian Politburo, led by Premier Oleksandr Lyashko, heard a report indicating that more than 55,000 people had left Kyiv the previous day, double the average number of railroad passengers leaving the city or passing through it. Close to 20,000 had left in buses and cars, and 9,000 by air. Kyivans were trying to protect themselves as best they could under the circumstances. The main concern was the health of their children. City authorities reported to the party bosses that on May the 4th, some 33,000 students, or 11% of the Kyivian student body, did not attend classes. On May the 6th, that number grew to 55,000 students, or close to 17% of the student body, and on May the 7th, 83,000 students, or 28% of the student body, failed to show up. On that day, 62% of the students were absent from schools in the Lenin district of the city, where most of the party and managerial elite, the people with the best access to information, resided. They were leaving before anyone else. Disturbed by the growing exodus from the city, Volodymyr Chernobyl, the party boss of Ukraine, called a meeting of the Ukrainian Politburo. The main question on the agenda was the evacuation of schoolchildren from the panic-stricken city of Kyiv. At the beginning of the meeting, Chernobyl welcomed two guests from Moscow, academician Leonid Ilyin, the 58-year-old director of the Institute of Biophysics, and the Soviet representative to the United Nations Committee on the Effects of Nuclear Radiation, and Yuri Israel, the 56-year-old director of the State Committee on Hydrology and Meteorology. They had been sent to Kiev by Boris Checherbina at the request of the Ukrainian government. According to the memoirs of Boris Kachura, who was present at the Politburo meeting, Shecherbitsky opened it with the following question, which was directed to Ilyin and Israel. "We have been advised that we are receiving incomplete information, and in that connection we would like to obtain a clear answer from you. Under what conditions and from what zones do we need to evacuate people? Where are they in danger?" Kachura recalled that the Ukrainian leader received a lukewarm answer from the Moscow scientists. "We are not authorized. We can't. The situation is dynamic. It's changing." Shecherbitsky refused to take no for an answer. "I have permission from Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev not to let you out of here until you give us such recommendations," he told his guests, turning them into hostages. Shecherbitsky later admitted to his aides that he had been bluffing. Gorbachev knew nothing about his meeting with the scientists, but Ilyin and Israel took his statement at face value. The problem was that they had no immediate answer to Shecherbitsky's question and needed time to consider it. They were given appropriate conditions, a room was assigned to them, all necessary arrangements were made, and they sat down with our Minister of Health, Romanenko, and began to prepare this document, recalled Kachura. Eventually they signed a statement indicating, according to Kachura, that there was no danger to the population in Kiev and other cities of Ukraine beyond the 30-kilometer zone, and that there was no need to evacuate anyone from anywhere. All that was required was to monitor strictly where milk was coming from, since there were very highly radioactive radionuclides in milk. Valentina Shevchenko, the chairwoman of the Ukrainian parliament and a Politburo member, was not satisfied with that answer. When the issue was raised of taking children out of the city, they shook their heads. That was out of the question. There was no need, she recalled. I burst into tears and asked, "If your children and grandchildren were in Kiev, would you take them out?" They remained silent. For us, that was a signal that the children had to be taken out. Premier Lyashko suspected that Ilyin and Israel were reluctant to take responsibility for measures as radical as those we were proposing, obviously because they understood that such measures would require huge expenditures. They agreed only to the evacuation of children from the vicinity of the Chernobyl power plant, who were being evacuated anyway. As the bureaucratic practice of shifting responsibility continued, the Moscow scientists wore down the Ukrainian party bosses. "We will have to make the decision ourselves," Shecherbitsky told Lyashko. "Just make sure that you don't allow panic to spread." They decided to end the school year for children younger than 15 earlier than usual, in the second half of May instead of late June, and to send those children to pioneer camps in the southern parts of the Soviet Union. Shevchenko got on the phone with her counterparts in other republics, asking them to take in children from Kiev. They agreed. But when government officials began to ask union authorities for additional trains to transport the children, they got a negative response from Moscow. Boris Shecherbina personally sent an angry telegram asking the Kiev authorities to stop spreading panic and cancel preparations for the partial evacuation. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev felt increasingly concerned about the international fallout resulting from the Soviet mishandling of the Chernobyl crisis. "What's going on there? I'm very anxious about that problem. The name of Gorbachev is starting to get a thrashing throughout the world in connection with that accident, so a kind of mass psychosis is developing in the world. What is the real situation there?" he asked Legasov when he called him a few days after his return to the Chernobyl zone. Legasov told the General Secretary that in his view the worst was over. The basic emissions from the destroyed unit have essentially been halted, and the situation is now under control. On the whole, we now more or less grasp the extent of pollution in the zone around the Chernobyl station and in the world at large. Indeed, on May the 5th, radioactive emissions from the reactor had begun to subside as suddenly as they had risen a few days earlier. On May the 6th, the emissions were estimated at 150,000 curies, which was 100 times lower than they had been on May the 5th. Gorbachev was satisfied with Legasov's answer. On May the 9th, Soviet Victory in Europe Day, a newly confident Gorbachev called Serhii in Kyiv to ask what was going on in the city. He was concerned about plans for evacuation. Serhii decided to play it safe and told Gorbachev it was Valentina Semyonovna Shevchenko who raised a panic, and we all succumbed to it. It was a sexist defense, but it worked in the macho culture of the Soviet leadership. When Serhii informed Shevchenko about Gorbachev's call, she asked, with tears in her eyes, what they were going to do now. "We will take them out," responded her boss. "No one is going to punish us for children." The government's plans called for the evacuation of 986,000 children from Kyiv and the vicinity surrounding it before the end of May. The authorities wanted to put an immediate stop to the chaotic exodus of children and their parents from the city. That day, Serhii, together with his young grandson, was seen at the memorial events in downtown Kyiv on the occasion of VE Day. Despite their own doubts, the authorities were determined to send reassuring messages to the citizens of Kyiv. If the first person in the Republic kept his grandson in Kyiv, it was apparently fine to keep their children there as well. That evening, at the Ivankiv headquarters of the State Commission, Valery Legasov was in a good mood as he prepared to celebrate VE Day. The previous day had brought more good news. Close to 20,000 tons of water had been pumped from beneath the reactor. Coupled with the news about falling levels of radiation, it seemed reason enough to look much more confidently into the future. Legasov and others were getting ready to take a few hours off to celebrate the holiday with a festive dinner. Legasov was spending the evening with Vitaly Masol, the representative of the Ukrainian government in Chernobyl, who later remembered that suddenly a flame leaped above the reactor, and then a pink glow appeared. We couldn't understand what had happened. Legasov did not hide his disappointment, writing in his own memoirs, "We were embittered, of course. The May the 9th holiday was ruined." Memories of the World War II victory aside, it was too early to celebrate success at Chernobyl. The reactor was by no means under control. No one knew what had caused the drop in radioactive emissions. The explanations provided later included three possibilities. The extremely high release of fission products on May the 4th and 5th had dramatically reduced the amount of those products in the reactor, causing the temperature inside it to drop. The entire amount of volatile radionuclides had been released on the same days, causing the drop in radioactivity levels on subsequent days. Or the high temperatures in the reactor on those days had caused a meltdown of fuel elements, turning them into liquid that penetrated the lower part of the reactor vault, where they were solidified owing to the low temperature created by the liquid nitrogen being pumped under the reactor. Only the third scenario credited the actions of the scientists, engineers, and workers for the sudden improvement of the situation. The China syndrome remained on the mind of academician Yevgeny Velikhov and many of his colleagues. As far as they were concerned, the reactor could still burn its way down to the underground waters. To prevent that, they wanted to freeze the soil under the reactor as soon as possible.